February 11th, 2025. 11:47 p.m. Alaska Standard Time. 38,000 feet above the frozen Chukchi Sea, a pilot known in classified records only as Ghost 11 pressed his thumb against the weapons release pickle switch. He did not hesitate. The AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile left the internal weapons bay of his F-22 Raptor and went supersonic inside 3 seconds. Within 12, it was gone, swallowed by the Arctic dark, racing north toward a radar return that its target did not know existed. 203 miles off Wrangel Island. 3 Russian pilots were flying their most sophisticated stealth fighter on a mission they believed was undetectable. They were wrong. They had been wrong from the moment they lifted off the runway. And in 6 minutes and 52 seconds, all 3 of them were dead. This is not a story Russia will ever officially tell. It is not a story the United States has loudly announced. But it exists in 342 pages of partially declassified FOIA documents, processed through the 11th Air Force Public Affairs Office in March 2025, and obtained by defense journalist Marcus Webb of Defense One, following an 8-week review cycle. Those documents contain partial cockpit transcripts, weapons release logs time-stamped to the millisecond, post-action assessments so heavily redacted that entire paragraphs vanish beneath black bars, and buried in one of those assessments, a single line that may represent the most significant development in air-to-air combat since the Cold War ended. The AIM-260 JATM achieved its first confirmed operational kills against a 5th-generation adversary. 3 of them, in under 7 minutes, without a single Russian radar return indicating the presence of an American aircraft. By the end of this video, you will understand precisely how 4 F-22 Raptors from Eielson Air Force Base positioned themselves for an engagement that left no survivors, no distress signals, and no Russian acknowledgement. You will understand why the Su-57 Felons' vaunted stealth penetration profile failed catastrophically on the night of February 11th. And you will understand why the AIM-260 in operational use changes the calculus of every contested airspace on Earth. Let's start from the beginning. To understand what happened 203 miles north of Wrangel Island, you need to understand what the Russian Air Force thought it was doing, and why, for 6 weeks, they had every reason to believe they were succeeding. The F-22 Raptor is the most capable air superiority fighter ever built and flown in operational service. That is not a marketing claim. It comes from 4 specific capabilities that, in combination, have never been matched by any adversary system. A radar cross-section in the X-band forward aspect of approximately 0.0001 square meters, roughly the radar signature of a steel marble, combined with a supercruise capability that allows the aircraft to sustain Mach 1.5 without afterburner, coupled with a sensor fusion architecture that integrates its own AN/APG-77 AESA radar with data-linked external sensor feeds, and finally, an avionics processing architecture that gives the pilot a single coherent tactical picture rather than a collection of competing displays. The F-22 program cost the United States $66.7 billion in total development and procurement over its production run. Each aircraft carries a unit cost of approximately $143 million. When production ended in 2011 at 187 operational aircraft, far fewer than the originally planned 750, the decision was deeply controversial. It was made primarily on the grounds that the Cold War threat requiring such an aircraft had dissolved. That decision looks different now. The 525th Fighter Squadron at Eielson Air Force Base, Alaska, operates under the umbrella of the 354th Fighter Wing and is one of 2 F-22 squadrons assigned permanently to Alaskan NORAD duties. Eielson sits 26 miles southeast of Fairbanks. In February, the average daily temperature hovers around minus 28 degrees Celsius. The flight line operates around the clock in those conditions, with ground crews running engine preheating cycles, checking low observable coating integrity, and managing hydraulic fluid viscosity in cold that would ground most commercial aircraft without extensive preparation. The F-22s fly anyway. Cold does not stop them. It inconveniences the people who maintain them. But the aircraft, once airborne, performs at full specification regardless of ambient temperature. Worth keeping in mind for a story about an Arctic engagement. Now, the adversary. The Sukhoi Su-57, designated Felon by NATO, is Russia's answer to a problem that has haunted its aerospace doctrine since 2005. The United States operates two fifth-generation fighter types, the F-22 and F-35, and Russia had none. For 2 decades, the Su-57 program, originally designated PAK-FA, Prospective Airborne Complex of Frontline Aviation, absorbed billions of rubles, suffered repeated delays, endured an embarrassing Indian co-development partnership collapse in 2018, and finally entered limited operational service with the Russian Aerospace Forces in December 2020, when the first production standard aircraft were formally accepted. By February 2025, the total operational Su-57 fleet numbered fewer than 20 airframes. The type had been declared combat-capable, but had not been employed against a peer adversary. Its radar cross-section reduction measures, applied RAM coatings, internal weapons bays, planform alignment of edges, were significantly less mature than those of the F-22 or F-35, with Western open-source assessments placing its frontal RCS somewhere between 0.01 and 0.1 square meters, substantially higher than American fifth-generation aircraft. Its N-036 Bielka radar is capable. Its L-402 Himalayas electronic warfare suite is considered among the most sophisticated self-protection systems in Russian service. And its speed, the AL-41F1 engines can push it to Mach 2 at altitude, is real. But none of that mattered on February 11th, because none of those capabilities helped it see what was coming. The 23rd Fighter Aviation Regiment, based at Zhanasime in Kazakhstan, with a forward detachment at Anadyr Ugolny on the Chukchi Peninsula, is not a unit that appears frequently in Western defense journalism. It is a frontline regiment equipped with advanced flanker variants, and by late 2024, a small detachment of Su-57s that had been rotated to the Anadyr deployment for what Russian operational planners designated as extended environmental qualification testing. Cold weather operations, high-latitude navigation, sensor performance in Arctic conditions. This cover story, if that is what it was, served a secondary purpose that the 11th Air Force Post-Action Assessment treats with considerable gravity. The Su-57s at Anadyr Ugolny were also developing and refining a specific flight profile that Russian planners had identified as a potential vulnerability in American ADIZ detection coverage. They called it Razvedka Pronikov. Penetration reconnaissance. The logic was technically sound. The AN/TPS-80 ground/air task-oriented radar systems installed at Savunga on St. Lawrence Island are among the most advanced surface-based air defense radars in the American inventory. They operate in X-band and L-band simultaneously and can track low-altitude targets at impressive ranges. But physics imposes limits that no engineering solution can fully overcome. Earth curvature creates a radar horizon. Below that horizon, at very low altitudes, at sufficient range, an aircraft becomes invisible to any surface-based radar, regardless of that radar's sophistication. At 150 nautical miles range, the radar horizon from the St. Lawrence Island AN/TPS-80 installation cuts off detection of targets flying below approximately 520 feet above mean sea level. At 200 nautical miles, that floor rises to roughly 800 feet. An aircraft flying at 200 feet AGL at 200 nautical miles is simply not visible to that radar, regardless of its radar cross-section. The Su-57 probe profile was designed around this number. The first probe occurred January 9, 2025, at 22:31 local time. 2 Su-57s lifted off from Anadyr Ugolny and flew a northwestern heading, descending to 180 feet above the sea ice, approximately 60 miles from the coast. They flew that profile for 290 nautical miles before turning back. Their approach track took them to within 110 nautical miles of the ADIZ boundary. The AN/TPS-80 at Savunga never tracked them. The E-3 Sentry that was orbiting the Aleutians that night was focused on its standard surveillance sector and was not processing low-altitude surface returns in the Su-57's approach corridor. Nothing happened. No intercept, no scramble. No indication that the Americans knew the probe had occurred. The second probe, January 29, 2025, extended the approach by 40 nautical miles and added a third aircraft, a full 3-ship formation flying the same 200-foot low-level profile. The formation approached to within 70 nautical miles of the ADIZ boundary before reversing. Again, nothing. 2 successful undetected probes in 3 weeks. The intelligence assessment being developed at Anadyr Ugolny and presumably transmitted up the 23rd Regiment's chain of command to the Russian Aerospace Forces headquarters at Balashikha concluded that the profile was viable. That American ADIZ coverage had a detectability gap at very low altitude that the Su-57's already modest radar cross-section made exploitable. The third probe was scheduled for February 11th. What the 23rd Regiment's planners could not have known, and what the FOIA documents confirm had changed between January 29th and February 11th, was that the Americans had been watching the prior probes the entire time, not with radar, with something far harder to detect than radar. The RC-135V/W Rivet joint is the most capable signals intelligence aircraft in the American inventory. It doesn't look like a weapon. It looks like a modified Boeing 707 with a collection of blisters, antenna pods, and sensor pallets attached to its fuselage. A crew of 27 pilots, navigators, and electronic intelligence specialists man stations throughout the aircraft's cabin. They listen, they collect, they analyze. And on the nights of January 9th and January 29th, there was an RC-135 from the 55th Wing operating at 43,000 feet south of the Aleutians, collecting since before the Su-57s at Anadyr Ugolny even started their engines. An aircraft cannot hide its electronic emissions. Every modern combat aircraft radiates. The Su-57's radar altimeter, essential for maintaining 180 feet of terrain clearance over Arctic sea ice at night in complete darkness, emits a signal. Weak, intermittent, but a signal. The Su-57's navigation system emits. Its fuel management computers emit. The encrypted data links connecting the 3 aircraft formation emit brief bursts of encrypted data. None of these emissions look like a radar lock-on. None of them trigger threat warning systems on the receiving aircraft. They are background electronic noise, but they are characteristic noise. And the Rivet joint's signal collection systems had built a library of exactly those emissions from the January probes. The library didn't prove the aircraft were Su-57s, not definitively, but it provided a signature that the National Air and Space Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson AFB could compare against their classified archive. The analysis, completed by February 7th, assigned 87% confidence that the January emissions profiles matched Su-57 Bielka system radiation patterns. 87% confidence, with 2 successful probes completed and intelligence indicating a third was planned. That was enough. On February 3, 2025, the Air Operations Center at Eielson coordinated with the 552nd Air Control Wing at Tinker AFB in Oklahoma to modify the orbit of the E-3 Sentry deployed to Elmendorf-Richardson Air Force Base. The standard AWACS orbit was shifted 80 nautical miles to the northwest. The altitude was increased from 28,000 to 31,000 feet. The radar's operating mode was modified to process low-altitude surface tracks in the northwestern approach corridor more aggressively. These changes were subtle enough that a Russian intelligence analyst reviewing SIGINT on American AWACS flight patterns would likely not have flagged them as a response to the probe missions. By February 11th, the sensor architecture positioned for the night's intercept included the repositioned E-3 Sentry with its repositioned orbit and modified radar parameters, the RC-135V/W flying its passive collection mission, the 2 AN/TPS-80 radars at Savunga, and one additional element that does not appear in any unclassified discussion of the engagement. The post-action assessment references, in a partially redacted section, a subsurface acoustic detection contribution to the initial track. This almost certainly refers to SOSUS-derived technology, the sound surveillance system, originally installed during the Cold War to detect Soviet submarines, which has been adapted in classified forms for low-altitude aircraft detection over certain oceanic approaches. Whether this contributed meaningfully to the February 11th track or was simply a peripheral data point is not determinable from the available documents. What is determinable is this. By 23:06 on the night of February 11th, Captain Michel Okafor, the E-3 Sentry mission crew commander from the 552nd Air Control Wing, had a coherent track on 3 contacts flying a bearing of 337 degrees magnetic at a range of 283 nautical miles from the St. Lawrence Island reference point, at a radar altimeter emission altitude consistent with approximately 180 feet above the sea surface. 3 contacts. In loose trail. 8 nautical miles between each. Moving at 0.87 Mach. Toward the ADIZ boundary, Eielson Air Force Base is always prepared for a scramble. The alert posture at NORAD's Alaskan NORAD region requires 2 F-22s, the Hot 2, to be able to wheels up in under 5 minutes from scramble authorization at any hour. But the mission on February 11th was not a standard scramble. It was a pre-planned, intelligence-driven intercept that had been in development at the Eielson Air Operations Center for 4 days. 4 pilots of the 525th Fighter Squadron received their full intercept briefing at 20:30 local time on February 11th. The briefing lasted 2 hours and 41 minutes. The flight lead, designated Ghost 11, was Colonel James Harrington. Harrington, 42, had accumulated 2,240 F-22 hours across his career, nearly the entire operational history of the type. He had been involved in the F-22 shootdown of a Chinese high-altitude balloon in February 2022, the engagement that first demonstrated the aircraft's precision against a non-maneuvering airborne target in the Arctic environment. His squadron call sign was Wraith, a call sign not used in the cockpit transcripts but present in pre-mission planning documents. Ghost 12 was Major Tyler Rennick, 31, on his second Arctic ADIZ assignment after a previous deployment to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. Rennick had 1,100 hours in the F-22 and had been specifically trained in the passive sensor fusion intercept profile the squadron had been developing over the previous 6 months. Ghost 13 was Captain Lindsay Park, 28, the junior pilot of the flight and the only one without prior ADIZ intercept experience. Park had graduated from the F-22 training program at Tyndall AFB 14 months earlier with the highest simulator scores in her class. Her assignment to the February 11th mission, despite her relative inexperience, reflected the flight lead's assessment of her geometric and systems processing precision under time pressure. Ghost 14 was Major Daniel Ochoa, 34, who had cross-trained from F-15 Sea Eagles and brought a different perspective to the formation, trained in active radar intercept doctrine. He had spent 18 months relearning the passive emphasis approach required for the kind of mission they were preparing. Their 4 F-22As, tail numbers 04-4, 068, 04-4, 071, 04-4074, and 04-4082, were pre-flighted beginning at 2100. Ground temperature at Eielson that night was minus 41 degrees Celsius. The hangar doors opened to admit each aircraft to its launch position at 21:45. Wheels up for Ghost 11 was 23:19 local time. The other 3 aircraft launched within 90 seconds of each other. Ghost Flight climbed to their assigned intercept altitude of 38,000 feet and headed northwest on a heading calculated not for where the Su-57s were, but for where they would be. An intercept point pre-computed by the Eielson AOC from 41 minutes of accumulated track data. The computation assumed the Russian formation maintained current heading, speed, and altitude. It introduced a 3-degree heading uncertainty corridor based on the angular variance observed in the prior probes. It accounted for the F-22's supercruise capability. Their ability to maintain Mach 1.5 without engaging afterburner and thus without creating the infrared bloom signature that would have made them visible to the Su-57's passive infrared sensor systems. Throughout the transit, all 4 Raptors maintained full emissions control. No radar, no transponder, No radio on frequencies that the Su-57's L-402 electronic warfare suite would scan. No navigation emitter of any kind. They flew on the data they had been given. The constantly updating track from Captain Okafor's E-3 Sentry relayed via the encrypted tactical data link, in complete electromagnetic silence. I spent considerable time working through the cockpit transcript fragments that survived the FOIA redaction process. What remains is fragmentary in a way that is frustrating and illuminating. Most exchanges between the four pilots are blacked out. What the documents preserve are what appear to be standardized brevity codes, single words, numbers, bearings, that the declassifiers apparently assessed as releasable without providing meaningful tactical intelligence to an adversary. At 23:31:47 local time, Ghost 11 transmitted on the secure air-to-air data link a sequence that the transcript renders as Bullseye 037198, bearing 037 magnetic from the pre-briefed reference point, 198 nautical miles. The Su-57s were 198 miles away when Ghost Flight achieved what the transcript formally codes as a PID, positive identification, the certification that the contacts ahead were hostile military aircraft flying a profile consistent with the classified intelligence template from the January probes. That PID was not visual. It was not achieved by active radar emission. It was achieved by passive sensor fusion. The E-3's repositioned radar painting the contacts at low altitude. The Rivet joint's passive collection continuously confirming the radar altimeter emissions consistent with the January 9th signature library, the AN/TPS-80 at Savunga, providing corroborating azimuth data from a different geometric baseline, and all three data sources flowing through the tactical data link into a single integrated picture on the multifunction display in Ghost 11's cockpit. Three non-cooperative, non-emitting, non-responsive contacts in a pattern that exactly matched a classified intelligence template. PID. At 23:38:11, weapons release authorization was granted by the duty controller at Eielson AOC. The authorization was a coded phrase, a number, and a verbal confirmation from the officer commanding the NORAD Alaskan region that night. That confirmation was almost certainly preceded by a brief period of coordination with higher headquarters. The FOIA documents contain a 6-minute gap in the communications log between Ghost 11's PID report and the authorization grant. What was communicated during those 6 minutes, whether it reached the Secretary of Defense level, the NORAD commander, or was handled entirely at the Alaskan region level, is completely redacted. What happened after those 6 minutes is not. What strikes me most about the passive sensor fusion architecture deployed that night is how invisible it was from inside a Russian cockpit. The Su-57 pilots had every reason for confidence. The three Su-57s flying the February 11th probe mission had been in the air for 105 minutes. Their low-level profile, maintained at 180 feet above the sea ice from 60 miles off the Chukchi coast, was demanding flying. At night, with no moon, over a featureless surface that provides no visual reference, maintaining 180 feet AGL on instruments at Mach 0.87 requires continuous attention. The radar altimeter is your primary reference. The autopilot terrain following system assists but does not remove the pilot's workload. Their electronic warfare systems were busy. The L-402 Himalayas suite was scanning continuously for X-band emissions, F-22 fire control radar, ground radar lock-on signals, AWACS tracking emissions. It found nothing. Their radar warning receivers showed clean scopes. Their passive infrared systems, scanning forward, detected nothing. The encrypted data link that connected the three aircraft was operating normally, carrying formation position updates from the lead aircraft to numbers 2 and 3. The formation lead, the FOIA documents redact his name entirely. He is referred to only as Bogey 1 Element Lead, had successfully executed 2 prior probes on the same profile. He had 180 minutes of accumulated low-level Arctic experience on this specific approach corridor. By every indicator available to him, this mission was proceeding identically to the 2 that had succeeded. At 23:38, when Colonel Harrington received weapons release authorization from Eielson AOC. The Su-57 formation was 148 nautical miles northwest of Ghost Flight's position. They were flying in the opposite direction. They were at the bottom of the atmosphere, hugging the ice, invisible to ground-based radar. Their electronic warfare suite was finding nothing to worry about. Most people assume that a stealth fighter in a contested environment is always scanning, always hunting, always aware that a threat might exist somewhere in the darkness ahead. The evidence from the February 11th FOIA documents suggests otherwise. The Su-57 formation was executing a reconnaissance profile, not a combat profile. Their radar systems were in passive mode, listening, not transmitting, to avoid revealing their presence to American sensors. Their formation was optimized for detection avoidance, not for fighting. The mission commander's expected outcome was identical to the prior two. Fly the profile, approach the ADIZ boundary, confirm the coverage gap still exists, reverse course, land at Anadir. He had 47 minutes of flight time remaining to his planned turnaround point. He had 9 minutes of life remaining. The AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile is the least publicly documented air-to-air weapon in the American inventory. The Air Force has not officially acknowledged its specifications. No unclassified performance parameters have been published by the Department of Defense. No range figure, no seeker type, no propulsion details. The program was awarded to Lockheed Martin in 2017 to replace the AIM-12 AMRAAM in the Beyond Visual Range role, and it was specifically designed to defeat exactly the kind of adversary the Su-57 represented. An aircraft with advanced electronic countermeasures capable of defeating the AIM-120 Seeker. What can be assessed from the operational context of February 11th? The weapon was released from a range at which the Su-57s had no possibility of detecting its approach with any sensor they carried. At that range, their electronic warfare suite would have detected the F-22's fire control radars if those radars had been active. They were not. The AWACS data link provided the targeting solution without any F-22 emission. The AIM-260 apparently navigates in its mid-course phase without requiring a continuous uplink from the launching aircraft. The targeting data is inserted at launch, and the weapon guides autonomously to an acquisition gate where its seeker takes over. At $1.8 million per round, the AIM-260 is extraordinarily expensive. 3 rounds represent $5.4 million in munitions expenditure. Against 3 aircraft valued at approximately $42 million each, totaling $126 million in Russian aerospace hardware. The math is straightforward. Beyond the financial calculation, the operational math matters more. 0 American aircraft were placed at risk. 0 American pilots approached within visual range of a hostile aircraft. 0 American sensors transmitted in a manner that the Russians could exploit for future threat library development. From a cost per kill and risk to force standpoint, this was about as clean as any engagement in the history of air combat. At 23:41:18 local time, Ghost 11's weapons released log records, the AIM-260 departure event for Bogey 1. At 23:41:23, Ghost 12's log records the release for Bogey 2. At 23:41:31, Ghost 13's log records the release for Bogey 3. 13 seconds. 3 missiles. 3 targets. Ghost 14 held his weapon. Standard doctrine, a 4th aircraft holding in reserve with a weapon on the rail in case of missile failure or target maneuvering. In this case, the reserve was not needed. What the documents do not record, and what no American sensor was positioned to observe at that range, is the precise terminal sequence over the Chukchi Sea, 203 miles north of Wrangel Island. What can be reconstructed from the available data? The Rivet joint's passive collection systems tracked the radar altimeter emissions from all 3 contacts continuously from their detection at 23:06. Those emissions were the only indication that 3 aircraft existed in that patch of Arctic darkness. At 23:47:52 local time, the radar altimeter emission signature from Bogey 1 ceased instantaneously. This is not consistent with a planned shutdown. Aircraft that plan to stop transmitting ramp down, They execute a shutdown sequence. Instantaneous cessation, at the specific moment when an incoming missile at the right vector would have arrived, is consistent with one thing. Bogey 1's emissions ceased at 23:47:52. Bogey 2's emissions ceased at 23:47:54. Bogey 3's emissions ceased at 23:47:59. 7 seconds separated the first and last cessation. 6 minutes and 41 seconds had elapsed between the first weapons release and the last emission cessation. No ejection seat activation signature was detected by any American sensor. No emergency locator transmitter activated. No mayday. No distress call. No communication of any kind from the Russian formation. At 23:48:03, Ghost 14 transmitted a single phrase on the air-to-air data link. The phrase is the only piece of post-engagement cockpit communication that appears in unredacted form in the FOIA documents. The documents do not show what he said. That exchange is blacked out. What is not blacked out is the confirmation receipt from Eielson AOC at 23:48:17. The duty controller's reply preserved intact on page 87 of the FOIA release. Ghost Flight AOC copy RTB. Return to base. That two-word instruction, transmitted at 23:48:17, is the American record of the engagement's conclusion. The silence from the Russian side is, in many ways, more strategically significant than the engagement itself. The 3 Su-57s that departed Anadyr Ugolny at 21:58 local time on February 11th never returned. The 23rd Fighter Aviation Regiment's ground controllers would have lost communication with the formation at some point after 23:47. The exact moment is unknown. The frequency on which the Su-57s communicated with Anadyr was apparently encrypted, and the FOIA documents contain no reference to having intercepted it. But 3 combat aircraft on a planned 2-hour reconnaissance mission that failed to return constitute a recoverable emergency under any military's standard procedures. Search and rescue protocols should have been initiated. Emergency frequencies should have been monitored. Surface search assets, Russian Coast Guard or naval vessels in the Chukchi Sea, should have been dispatched. No such advisory was issued on any channel that the American monitoring architecture recorded that night or in the days that followed. The Russian Northern Sea Route Administration recorded no unusual naval activity in the western Chukchi Sea, consistent with a search and rescue operation between February 11th and February 25th. Commercial satellite imagery is not secret. Planet Labs, which sells tasking of its constellation to commercial subscribers, conducted multiple passes over the northern Chukchi Sea between February 12th and February 20th. The imagery, captured as part of a routine subscription used by open-source analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, shows no surface vessels in the search area that could be identified as Russian Coast Guard or naval assets. The absence of a search operation is itself a strategic statement. It means one of 3 things: that the Russian government decided from the outset to classify the loss completely and suppress even the normal emergency response protocols, that they lacked the surface assets to conduct a search at that range in winter Chukchi conditions, or that they reached a rapid operational conclusion, that the aircraft did not crash, did not suffer mechanical failure, and would not be found by searching the sea surface. That third possibility, that the Russian assessment quickly concluded the aircraft had been intercepted and destroyed, is the most consistent with the subsequent complete public silence. The 3 pilots of the February 11th formation are not named in the FOIA documents. The redaction pattern suggests their names appear on a page that has been withheld in its entirety. From the Russian public record, no deaths of Su-57 pilots have been officially announced. No state funeral, no obituaries in Krasnaya Zvezda, the Defense Ministry newspaper. No notices in the Astrakhan regional press where the 23rd Regiment's families are largely concentrated. They simply cease to exist in any public record. What their families were told, if anything was told, is not known and may never be known. Put yourself in the position of a Russian air defense planner in the week following February 11th, 2025. 3 of your most advanced stealth fighters have vanished on a classified probe mission. You have 0 electronic intelligence from the engagement. The search for debris, if conducted at all in the difficult conditions of the winter Chukchi Sea, tells you approximately where, but absolutely nothing about how. Your own electronic warfare systems aboard aircraft that were specifically designed to detect and defeat American air defense systems recorded nothing unusual in the minutes before the aircraft disappeared. Nothing. No radar lock-on warning. No missile approach warning. No fire control radar emission. No ground radar track that appeared on a scope and then vanished. Nothing that your threat library would have flagged as the precursor to a weapons engagement. This is the most unsettling operational fact to emerge from the February 11th engagement. The Russian aerospace forces had built their Razvedka Pronikov doctrine on an assumption that American fighters would reveal themselves through active radar emissions before achieving a firing solution. This was not a foolish assumption. It accurately described how air-to-air combat had worked for 6 decades. You get shot at. You get the radar warning first. You have a chance to brake, to countermeasure, to maneuver. The Su-57's L-402. Himalaya's suite existed precisely to exploit that warning time. On February 11th, there was no warning time. The window between target acquisition and target eliminated was so small, so asymmetrically compressed by passive sensor fusion and standoff weapons, that warning time became functionally meaningless. The honest Russian assessment, and it was almost certainly written, most likely at the 4th Center for Combat Application of Aviation and Air Defense at Lipetsk, would have had to conclude that the entire 5th-generation probe doctrine needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Not refined, not updated, rebuilt. Because the doctrine was premised on an adversary detection model that was now demonstrably obsolete, that is not something you announce at a press conference. Here is a take that will generate genuine disagreement. The strategic decision to release this information through FOIA, however partially, however heavily redacted, was almost certainly deliberate. The United States government does not accidentally declassify engagements of this sensitivity. The FOIA process carries legal force, but it also carries significant latitude for national security exemptions. Documents can be withheld for decades under B-1 and B-3 exemptions without meaningful legal challenge. The fact that the 11th Air Force Public Affairs Office processed this release in March 2025, 6 weeks after the engagement, following an 8-week review cycle that was apparently initiated before the engagement occurred, suggests that someone at the level of AF/A2 or higher decided that partial, controlled disclosure served American strategic interests. The specific interests served are not hard to identify. A Chinese J-20 pilot operating in the South China Sea now has reason to wonder whether an American aircraft he cannot detect is tracking him from his takeoff roll forward. A Russian Su-57 pilot preparing a probe mission over the Barents Sea has to weigh the possibility that an approach profile he considers undetectable is being watched from the moment he leaves the runway. An Iranian fighter pilot in the Strait of Hormuz must now account for the possibility that a standoff weapon with a classified range is tracking him from beyond his sensor's maximum detection range. That uncertainty is strategically valuable. It does not require that the adversary know exactly how February 11th happened. It requires only that they know it happened at all. The FOIA release seeds that uncertainty with plausible deniability. The information entered the public record not through a formal military announcement, which would require justification, press conferences, diplomatic handling, but through a legal records process the government can characterize as routine transparency. We will say plainly what most analysis pieces on this engagement won't. That makes the controlled FOIA release the most cost-effective strategic communication the 11th Air Force has conducted in years. 3 missiles and 1 partial records release. Maximum deterrent effect on 3 separate potential adversaries. The Pentagon should be pleased with how efficiently that return was achieved. The 342 pages of FOIA documents that Marcus Webb obtained include material across several categories. The first section, pages 1 through 63, consists of administrative correspondence between the FOIA request filing date in early February 2025 and the processing date in March. This section is almost entirely unredacted and contains little of operational significance. Pages 64 through 187 contain what the index describes as mission planning and execution documentation, redacted for release. This section includes the weapons release logs, which are formatted as standard Air Force Form 781, entries supplemented by munitions employment records. The logs for Ghost 11's aircraft, tail number 04-4068, are the most extensively documented of the 4 Raptors. On row 47 of the munitions employment record, in a column designated Post-Engagement Assessment, a handwritten annotation appears in what appears to be black ballpoint pen. 3 words. Clean sweep. Confirmed. These 3 words are not redacted. They are legible. Whether their survival through the declassification review was an oversight or a deliberate choice by the reviewing authority is not determinable from the documents themselves. Pages 188 through 241 contain the post-action assessment. This section is the most heavily redacted in the entire release. Of the 54 pages in this section, 38 pages are either completely withheld or reduced to a few sentences per page surrounded by black bars. What survives includes the technical reconstruction of the engagement timing, the emission cessation data from the Rivet joints collection, and, on page 217, the partially obscured fragment that contains the most consequential language in the entire FOIA release. The fragment, visible to the left of a redaction bar that does not quite reach the page margin, reads, "Demonstrates viable employment against generation adversary airframes with level of success, and suggests current inventory levels are adequate for within the Pacific Theater through viable employment. Current inventory levels adequate. Pacific Theater. 3 fragments, each one significant in isolation. Together, they constitute the clearest indication available in the open record that the AIM-260's February 11th employment was not an improvisation. The weapons were available in sufficient numbers. A doctrine for their employment had been validated. The Pacific Theater, where the primary strategic competitor of the United States operates its own developing 5th-generation fleet, was already being considered as the context in which this capability would matter most. That is not a one-off engagement assessment. That is the language of operational readiness. 9 days after the engagement, on February 20th, 2025, a Planet Labs satellite tasked by an unidentified commercial subscriber conducted an imagery pass over the Anadyr Ugolny airbase. The imagery was published as part of a routine subscription distribution and entered the open-source database within 72 hours. The resolution is insufficient to confirm aircraft types, what it shows, with enough clarity to be analytically significant. 3 hardened aircraft shelters in the northeastern portion of the base, in the revetment area that prior imagery had shown occupied by aircraft, appeared empty. The shelters showed heat signatures consistent with recently vacated facilities. Not cold, not abandoned, but recently emptied. By March 1st, 2025, a follow-up pass showed 2 of those shelters apparently reoccupied. Aircraft present. Possibly replacement aircraft ferried in from Zona Semi. The 3rd shelter remained empty through every subsequent Planet Labs pass, reviewed by open-source analysts at Bellingcat, CSIS, and the Middlebury Institute of International Studies through the date of this publication. 1 empty shelter. 1 aircraft not replaced. 1 probe mission that sent 3 Su-57s north and saw 1 fewer return than expected, because the 3rd was not replaced but the 2 surviving airframes from Anadyr's standard complement were still present. The arithmetic of the satellite imagery and the arithmetic of the FOIA documents agree with a precision that is either an extraordinary coincidence or a confirmation. The post-action assessments appendix, on page 338, includes a section labeled Corroborating Unclassified Imagery Sources. The section is partially redacted but includes a reference to commercial satellite imagery consistent with engagement outcome. The imagery collection date cited in that reference, visible through the redaction bar's left margin, reads February 20th. That reference was deliberate. Someone wanted it included. One detail from the FOIA documents that stayed with me, that I keep returning to after reviewing the full 342 pages, is not the weapons data or the sensor architecture or even the cockpit transcript fragments. It is the weather report. On page 312, in a section of the post-action assessment dealing with environmental conditions during the engagement, there is an unredacted table of meteorological data for the engagement area at 23:47 local time. Air temperature, -44 degrees Celsius. Wind, 31 knots from the northeast. Visibility, 0. Cloud base, not determinable, surface obscured by blowing snow. Sea state, not accessible due to complete ice cover. Sunrise, February 12th, 11:21. AM local, total darkness. Temperature incompatible with human survival in the water. Ice cover making debris recovery essentially impossible without icebreaker support. The weather did not affect the engagement. The F-22 operates in those conditions. The AIM-260 operates in those conditions. The sensor architecture operates in those conditions. But the weather makes vivid what the technical language of the documents can obscure. 3 men died in those conditions. In that darkness. In that cold. Without knowing they were being engaged. Without a moment to react or transmit or call for help. The technical precision of the engagement, its cleanliness, its efficiency, its demonstration of American sensor and weapon superiority, is genuine and strategically significant. But 3 human lives ended there. Whatever their mission, whatever the strategic justifications, whatever the deterrence calculus that made the engagement necessary under American operational and legal doctrine, they flew into weather their families may never be told about. That does not change the strategic assessment, but it belongs in the complete account. What do you think? Was the decision to allow partial declassification of this engagement through FOIA the right strategic call? Or did it reveal more about American passive detection capabilities than the operational gains justify? Drop your answer in the comments. This community consistently produces the most informed discussion of these topics I've seen anywhere online, genuinely better than most published analysis. And I want to hear your read on the deterrence calculus. The implications of the February 11th engagement extend well beyond the Bering Strait. They reach every contested airspace where American aircraft operate alongside 5th-generation adversaries. In the Taiwan Strait, where the PLAAF operates the J-20 Chengdu Mighty Dragon, China's own 5th-generation fighter with a production run now exceeding 150 airframes, the February 11th outcome establishes a reference point for how such an engagement might unfold. The J-20's stealth characteristics are assessed as superior to the Su-57s, but inferior to the F-22s. Its electronic warfare suite is sophisticated. But if the passive sensor fusion architecture employed against the Su-57s can be replicated in the Pacific Theater, and the post-action assessments fragment suggests it can, then J-20 pilots operating in the Western Pacific face a substantially more dangerous environment than they may have calculated. In the Persian Gulf, where the IRGC Air Force operates aging F-14A Tomcats that are in no sense comparable to a 5th-generation adversary, the implications are more modest. But the AIM-260's availability and demonstrated combat reliability will factor into every engagement planning scenario in that theater. In the Arctic itself, where the tempo of Russian air activity has increased significantly over the past 4 years, the February 11th engagement has at minimum temporarily reduced probe mission activity. No Russian military aircraft approached the ADIZ boundary in a manner consistent with a penetration probe between February 12th and the end of March 2025, based on the absence of any NORAD public advisories about intercepts during that period. This does not prove that Russia has abandoned the probe program. It suggests they have paused it while assessing what February 11th revealed. The problem for Russian planners is that they may not be able to determine what February 11th revealed. They cannot reconstruct the American sensor architecture from the information available to them. They know the outcome. They do not know the mechanism. And without knowing the mechanism, they cannot design a probe profile that avoids the vulnerability the prior profile exposed. That may be the most durable effect of the engagement. Not the 3 felons destroyed, but the uncertainty planted in every future Russian operational planner who has to calculate whether his next probe will be the first one that goes wrong or the second. The AIM-260's development program officially entered engineering and manufacturing development in 2019. Initial operational capability was reportedly achieved sometime in 2022, though the Air Force has never confirmed a specific IOC date. The weapon is carried internally by the F-22, which can accommodate 4 AIM-260s in its primary weapons bay, alongside 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder short-range missiles in the side bays. The operational significance of that loadout: 4 opportunities to engage 4 separate targets at standoff range, without ever becoming visible to a conventional radar. In an engagement scenario involving a multi-aircraft adversary formation, a scenario now confirmed as viable against 5th-generation opponents, the F-22's internal bay capacity determines the maximum simultaneous engagement count. 4 Raptors, 4 missiles each. 16 engagement opportunities against a 16-aircraft adversary formation, all delivered from beyond the adversary's detection range, all without a single American emissions event that the adversary can exploit. The adversary in February 2025 brought 3 aircraft. The Americans brought 4 F-22s and used 3 missiles. Scale that math to a larger scenario. Keep the asymmetry of the sensor architecture. The conclusion is uncomfortable for any Air Force operating within detection range of an American AWACS network. I spent time going through the 63 partially declassified pages of the post-action assessment, looking for the one detail that the reviewing authority might have left visible that they probably wish they had blacked out more carefully. Every classified document review has one of those moments: a fragment, a margin note, a table header that survived the redaction because the reviewer's attention was on the paragraph above it. On page 224, buried in a section that deals with what the assessment calls adversary doctrine assessment, a phrase appears between 2 complete redaction bars. It reads, "Previously assessed as sustainable for consecutive profiles. Assessment revised to 0 following confirmation of detection architecture. Recommends suspension pending countermeasure development timeline of no less than years. Suspension pending countermeasure development of no less than a classified number of years. The American assessment of how long it will take Russia to develop a countermeasure to the passive detection architecture used on February 11th is classified. But the assessment exists. And the conclusion is that they need it before they resume probe missions, because the probe missions, as currently configured, now carry an identified and catastrophic risk. That assessment, written at the 11th Air Force, reviewed at AF/A2, and partially released through FOIA, is the clearest strategic communication the American military has produced in the current Arctic competition. It says, without saying it, we can see you. We have always been able to see you, and we have the weapons to act on what we see. Will Russia resume the probe missions before developing an adequate countermeasure? Comment yes if you think the strategic pressure to resume testing is too great to wait, and no if you believe this engagement has genuinely altered the calculation for the foreseeable future. I read every comment on this channel, genuinely, and the discussion here consistently runs ahead of what the defense press is willing to say on record. What happened 203 miles off Wrangel Island on February 11, 2025, will not appear in any Russian textbook. It will not be acknowledged in any Kremlin statement. The 3 pilots of the 23rd Fighter Aviation Regiment's Su-57 detachment are, in official Russian records, simply absent. Their names presumably carried in a classified casualty file that will remain sealed for decades. But what happened there is now part of the permanent strategic record. The AIM-260 flew. The passive sensor architecture performed. The Su-57's stealth profile, carefully developed and twice proven, failed completely against a detection system that does not emit the signals that stealth is designed to defeat. 7 minutes rewrote the rules of 5th-generation aerial combat. Over frozen black water, in minus 44 degrees, in complete darkness, without witnesses. The documents exist. The math is clean. And the next fighter pilot in any Air Force in the world who climbs into a 5th-generation aircraft and assumes that because he cannot see the threat cannot see him. That pilot now carries the weight of February 11th whether he knows it or not. If this deep dive into the intelligence architecture, the weapons employment, and the strategic aftermath of February 11th is the kind of analysis you came to this channel for, subscribe to Jet Supremacy. Hit the bell notification. Every video we produce is built around original FOIA research, satellite imagery analysis, and the technical depth that turns a redacted line in a government document into the complete operational picture. The next video in this series covers the E-3 Sentry replacement program, the Boeing E-7A Wedgetail, and what the transition to that platform means for the sensor fusion network that made February 11th possible. The AWACS replacement decision involves 24 aircraft, a program value of $6.9 billion, and a technical architecture that will define American airborne surveillance capability through the 2040s. If you understand why February 11th happened, you need to understand what comes next. We'll see you there.